From 2007 to 8, Putin came to believe that the West would offer no resistance to his expansionist aims. It's at that moment he pronounced a more assertive Russia and started to act accordingly on the world stage and in relations to neighbouring countries, with the invasion of Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014. NATO provocation is one excuse given for Russian aggression, but it's unlikely that he saw NATO as a threat and must have known that they had neither the intent nor capability to directly threaten Russian territory. This series of miscalculations have led Russia into a disastrous war and may have led Putin's kleptocratic system to the very edge of collapse. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce. It will help other people to discover the fantastic guests that we have. William Felix Browder is an American-born British financier and political activist. He is the CEO and co-founder of Hermitage Capital Management, which at one time was the largest foreign portfolio investor in Russia. The Hermitage Fund was the best-performing fund in the world at the time, and the primary investment strategy of Browder was shareholder rights activism. Browder took on large Russian companies and vested interests such as Gazprom, Surgutneftegaz, United Energy System, and Sidanco. But this led to retaliation, and eventually he was refused entry to Russia, deported to the UK, and declared a threat to Russian national security. Well, Bill, it's a huge pleasure to speak to you today. Let's sort of jump in with the initial question, and that really is, you started out having a much more optimistic view, didn't you, on Putin's reforms? When did things start to go sour?
Well, so when I got to Russia, I moved to Russia full-time in 1996. This was the time when Yeltsin had begun his second term as president. At the time, it was, I think, best described as total chaos and anarchy in Russia. There was, I guess, political democracy and free speech, but it was a completely, I guess, sort of Wild West type of situation where there were no rules, there were no property rights. And as a result, you ended up in a situation where 22 oligarchs ended up controlling 40% of the GDP of Russia. And if you were to add on, maybe the next 100 oligarchs, you get up to like 75% of the GDP of Russia. And everybody else lived in destitute poverty. Then you get this guy. So Yeltsin was a drunk. He was unhealthy. He had a heart condition. He was really unable to manage the situation. He needed to pass the baton to someone else who could do two things. First, pardon him on day one so that any crimes he committed he'd be held responsible for. And second, then remain president for long enough for that pardon to sort of form and stick. And so he ended up picking three guys before Putin who didn't satisfy one of those two criteria. And then he picked Putin as sort of a really last choice. And Putin becomes president. And his big pitch to the Russian people to sort of get them to rally around was that he was going to end the power of the oligarchs so that the average Russian wasn't living in destitute poverty. And it sounded like a pretty good idea to me and anybody else who was in Russia at the time, because it was just so fantastically unfair what was happening to the average person in Russia. I mean, it was just horrible, really. And so we all kind of made the mistake of applying our hopes to a situation which really wasn't all that hopeful. So he comes in, and Putin, by the way, has this totally empty face. You can kind of attribute anything you want to his face. You can say, oh, he's a reformer, he's a nasty villain. You can kind of say anything you want about him, and anything is true because it's just a blank canvas. He doesn't give you any information in which to make any judgments. And so most people were kind of optimistic, and he started out his presidency not as this ultra powerful guy he is right now, but as a kind of tentative guy, because the oligarchs had all the power. They had stolen the power from the president, and so Putin comes in, and I would argue within the first 2 to 3 years, he was really kind of an uninspiring technocrat. He was He spoke a little English. He wasn't drunk. He was slim, all things that Yeltsin wasn't. And he had a series of policies like reforming the tax code and the land code and all this other stuff. And so you can kind of, if you had a checklist of economic reforms, you say, this guy's a technocratic reformer going through this stuff. He's not charismatic at all. He was a tiny little man who didn't inspire any kind of, enthusiasm. But at the same time, he was a breath of fresh air from the sort of chaos of the Yeltsin era. And then in the third year of his presidency, in 2003, he arrested the richest oligarch in Russia, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the owner of an oil company called Yukos. He arrests him, which is pretty unusual because the idea was that the oligarchs were untouchable. The oligarchs were more powerful than the president. And all of a sudden, the president is arresting this guy who looks who in theory is more powerful. And he puts him on trial, and he allows the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage in a courtroom. And everybody said, "Oh, he'll be out in a week. In a week, he wasn't out, and he'll be out in a month. In a month, he wasn't out." And then slowly but surely, people said, "Wow, maybe this Putin guy is for real. He's got the Khodorkovsky in jail."
And wasn't accidental, was it, that they chose him? It's not just that he was rich. It's not just that he was one of the 22. There was this pivotal moment, wasn't there, where he spoke out in public, in a public forum, and he challenged Putin on camera, didn't he? I remember seeing that sort of video, thinking that's not going to go well.
He challenged Putin. He said that there's corruption going on. Not that Khodorkovsky was uncorrupt as well. I mean, he was like every other oligarch, but he had kind of cleaned up his act. And so he challenges Putin and said there's terrible corruption going on in I think it was Rosneft. The Rosneft bought, which is a state-owned Russian company, had bought some other Russian oil assets at some hugely inflated price to enrich some friend of Putin's. And he pointed this out in this meeting with these oligarchs and Putin. And Putin got really nasty. He kind of like squinted his eyes and furrowed his forehead and said, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones or something to that effect. And then very shortly afterwards, that was what led to his arrest. But Putin is a guy who likes to rule by symbolism. And, if you look at Russia on a map, it's the most expansive country in the world. It's huge. It goes 11 time zone. It goes, from Asia to Europe. And there's just no way that anyone can micromanage that country. And so the only way that Putin can create any kind of discipline is by creating examples. And so he arrests the richest guy in Russia. And I would say that Khodorkovsky's main crime was just being rich. The fact that he talked back to him was a crime as well in Putin's mind, but not as big as the fact that he was the richest guy in Russia. So he arrests the richest guy in Russia. And all the other oligarchs see this. And when Putin sentences Khodorkovsky to 10 years in jail, it wasn't the court who sentenced him, it was Putin. The other oligarchs said, "Oh my God, this game is different than it was before." And they went to Putin and said, "Okay, what do we have to do so we don't get arrested?" And Putin said 50%. And that was the moment that everything changed in Russia. And that was the moment that Putin became the richest man in the world.
And your own story really feeds into this, doesn't it? Because you've got this investment capital fund. It's hugely successful, and you're applying essentially Western techniques of probity, and improving shareholder value, pointing out corruption, and in that way increasing sort of shareholder value by trying to also improve the economic efficiency and transparency. This quite quickly runs into a series of problems, though, doesn't it? And it eventually results in the extraordinary heist of your business. So could you sort of describe that, but relate it back to this growing system of nepotism and corruption that Putin started, this kleptocracy that Putin started to build around him?
So when Putin first came into power, our interests were aligned. He was fighting with the same guys I was fighting with. The oligarchs were stealing power from him at the same time as they were stealing money from me. And so when I was publicizing the scandals, the corruption scandals in these big companies I was investing in, Putin would step in. I should point out, I've never met the guy. I had not had a conversation with him then or since then or now. But we get these articles in the Wall Street Journal, and then they'd be in Kommersant, one of their big business newspapers, and all of a sudden there would be a scandal, and then Putin would do something about that scandal because it was serving his interests. Your enemy's enemy is your friend. And so for a while, it was all going well. We had this strange alignment of interests. But then when he did that deal with the oligarchs, he was no longer enemies with the oligarchs. He was business partners with the oligarchs. And so I continue with my anti-corruption exposés, but I'm no longer now. Of course, it goes against him. And so in 2005, I was expelled from the country and declared a threat to national security. In 2007, my offices in Moscow were raided by 25 Russian police officers. And at that point, I hired a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky to investigate why the offices were raided. And he goes and investigates. And he discovers that the purpose of the office raids were to gather a bunch of documents and then use those documents. These are sort of financial documents that belong to me and my companies. And to use those documents to orchestrate a very complex fraud in which they stole $230 million of taxes that my firm had paid to the Russian government. We had a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky who investigated and exposed the fraud. And Sergei was then arrested by the same people he testified against, put in pretrial detention, tortured for 358 days, and murdered in Russian police custody on November 16, 2009, at the age of 37, leaving a wife and two children. And his murder was the sort of turning point of my life. I was a full-time fund manager in Russia, and all of a sudden, a guy who was one of my people had been killed because he worked for me, because he was one of my people, and that affected me very profoundly. And I decided to give up my life as a businessman and to devote all of my time, energy, and resources to go after the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and make sure they face justice. And for the last 13 years since he was murdered, that's what I've been doing.
And the Magnitsky Act, which has now been passed in multiple countries, and it's still evolving, isn't it? That's an extraordinary legacy in his memory. But that also has enraged Putin as well, hasn't it? I mean, they absolutely livid, I think, when that was passed by US Congress. And what was your impression then? And at any point, have they given sort of, apart from the obvious signals of trying to have you arrested, etc., have you received sort of threats or messages from them as you've been on this journey to try and persuade you to give it up?
Well, Russia is a criminal country. I mean, there's no question. It's just a total mafia state. It's a place in the world of the mafia, money is more valuable than human life. And I've done the unforgivable thing, which is I got this legislation passed, the Magnitsky Act, named after my murdered lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, which freezes the assets of human rights violators and corrupt officials. And for a person who values money more than human life, that's unforgivable. And so they did two things. The Russian government, Putin, made it a sort of top priority in writing, their most important foreign policy priority, to try to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And then they went after me personally in every way that they could. I've been threatened with death on multiple occasions, kidnapping. They've issued 8 Interpol arrest warrants for me. I was arrested once in Madrid, once in Geneva. They've tried desperately to get me extradited from the UK. And they either want to kill me abroad or get me back to Russia through what I call, quote, legal means, arrest warrants, to then torture me in Russia, roll me out on television to retract all of my claims about their criminality and then to kill me in prison. That's their fantasy. So far, I've been very successful at not getting arrested. Well, actually, I've been arrested, but not getting sent back there. But it's been a constant sort of cat and mouse game. There's this expression, I've got to be lucky every day. They only have to be lucky once. And so it's been a very long and arduous road for me to deal with all this nastiness. But 13 years into it, I'm still here, which is, I guess, a pretty big accomplishment, pretty important to me anyways.
Absolutely. You and obviously your loved ones and colleagues as well. And there are ample examples of, them succeeding. I mean, they've had Navalny now for, I think it's more than a year, isn't it? And obviously physically, he's in a terrible condition in prison. Mikhail Saakashvili is also potentially undergoing that same kind of torture at the bequest of the Russian forces in Georgia. So, and Litvinenko, Skripal, there are many examples of people who, as you say, had that unlucky day.
Yeah.
I know you've also been a champion of Saakashvili. Is that because you feel some empathy for him, or is this really part of your wider struggle against, Russian influence, its expansionism, and the way it exports its kind of nepotistic, corrupt, and highly aggressive system of government, or tries to export it into neighboring countries?
Well, I mean, the situation with Saakashvili is just so heartbreaking, and it's just indescribable. If you could put up a picture here on the screen of what he looks like, I don't think anyone would have any doubt that this man, the former president of Georgia, who Putin said, he stood up to Putin. Saakashvili was a president of Georgia. Putin invaded Georgia. He resisted, fought back very hard. And Putin said, we're going to hang this guy by the balls. He said this very publicly to the French president at the time. Anyways, time has gone by. He loses his seat as the president in a democratic process, willingly steps down, which is very unusual in this part of the world. And 2012, and then about 9 years later, he shows up back in Georgia, and they arrest him. They put him in jail. They torture him. They poison him in prison. And if you look at a picture of him right now, it's just shocking. He's literally lost 100 pounds. He looks like a prisoner in a concentration camp. You can see his bones sticking out in his chest. The forensic doctors have detected poison, arsenic, and various other heavy metals, which they've poisoned him with. He's suffering from dementia at the age of 50 something. It's horrifying. And the government of Georgia is a pro-Russian government under Russian control. There's a guy named Ivanishvili, who's a former Russian oligarch, or a Georgian oligarch who made his money in Russia, who's very much sympathetic to Putin. And this is Putin's way of getting back. And again, he's a man who likes to send messages. And this is a message, which is, if you're a head of state, doesn't matter how long ago, and you stand up to me, we're going to come after you. And they're slowly killing him. He's in critical condition. And so there's nothing political about this. It's just shocking and horrible. And any decent human being who sees what's going on there, it will be, you want this man to be released into the medical care of specialists in Western Europe or the United States who can hopefully, reverse this terrible decline, which it's just horrifying.
And of course, it does also serve the purpose of sending a message, the same as the assassination of Boris Nemtsov outside the walls of the Kremlin. At that point, you're in the sort of hybrid information warfare. They can throw up confusion, multiple stories like they did with MH17 as well. It wasn't us. We wouldn't do it. That's so brazen. And to an extent, many people would actually believe or get confused enough. Now I think we understand what kind of a beast Russia is. And it's become abundantly clear to everybody, their methodology in Ukraine. But the treatment of Misha Saakashvili, doesn't it also highlight that, unless the entire system around Putin is gone, even if Ukraine wins this war, there is still going to be a threat of control, coercion, and aggression against all the states that border Russia and resist, the Kremlin's meddling in their affairs.
Well, it's absolutely clear. I mean, the big problem with the end of the Cold War is that it never really ended. When Nazi Germany collapsed and Japan collapsed at the Second World War, they completely collapsed. And we could replace all the horrible system with something new. And when the Cold War ended, the whole apparatus of the KGB stayed firmly intact. And that's the apparatus that they're using to spread murder, fear, death all over the world, and particularly in neighboring countries. And one of the reasons why this war in Ukraine is so significant, above and beyond just the tragedy of what's going on in Ukraine, is that they need to be defeated. The Putinism, KGBism, needs to be defeated firmly and overwhelmingly, so that whatever comes next is no threat to all these other countries and to the stability of the world.
And it needs to be pulled out root and branch. I mean, this is an interesting question because, the Russian opposition are very much focusing on issues of corruption. They're focusing on issues which they think, the population will largely respond to. They're perhaps not embracing, apart from Khodorkovsky, who's moving in that direction, they're not embracing the idea of decolonization and sort of ground-up reforms. This is going to be very, very difficult, isn't it, to pull out the roots of this FSB, KGB system. And when I was a student in the 90s, when you were obviously managing your portfolio, I got the impression that the state security system was merging with the mafia. And that was a process that happened through the 90s. Now, you must have spoken to many more people who were seeing this process take place than I could. What were your impressions of that chaotic 90s and the emergence of mafia groupings and how they sort of converged with these sort of state organs of terror and corruption?
Well, so when I first got to Moscow in 1996, there was two distinct groups. There was criminals. They were wearing leather jackets and gold chains and driving around in souped up Mercedes. And you could kind of avoid the criminality if you just didn't wear, nice clothes or drive a nice car, because it was all like in your face. It was all out in the street. And then Putin took over. And when Putin took over, there was a merger between organized crime and the state. It was a total merger. So, and it's very interesting because, for many years afterwards, people continued to sort of refer to the Russian state and organized crime as two distinct entities. And I said, no, they're absolutely the same. And I could show you, real life examples of how the merger has taken place. And many people didn't want to think about it in those terms. It's kind of hard to even imagine that, you could have a government meeting where they would be talking about tax policy, and then the next meeting, they'd be talking about which poisons to use to kill their enemies. The same exact people would be, ordering assassinations, mafia hits, and, talking about interest rate policy. I mean, and it's something that's really hard for people to get their heads around. And it's particularly hard for, heads of state, Barack Obama, George Bush, George W. Bush, Tony Blair, Boris Johnson, all these people, it's hard to imagine that like a counterpart that sits in the same room as them is a cold-blooded murderer. And so they were all coming up with policies on how to create incentives for Russia to work more cooperatively and setting resets and trying to use personal charm. You can't use that with a criminal. Criminals just like sort of thinking, God, what a weak sucker this person is. And Putin would always enjoy himself when a new head of state came in and that person would come and try to charm him into behaving himself, because that just gave Putin an extra year or two of leeway.
And he probably had already figured out what scared those individuals, like that incident with Merkel, where he found out that she was afraid of dogs. So somehow he brought a big dog into her vicinity. I think there was some story like that. I mean,
he also threatened Boris Johnson. He said, I could nuke you in London. It's totally, I mean, it's kind of a totally different game. These guys are all trying to do like diplomacy and international relations, and Putin is like saying, I'll kill you. And like Boris Johnson didn't sign up for that.
No, I mean, that partly explains why he's being so strong. Even though he's out of office, he's still sort of pushing against that issue. Well, we'll come to that in a minute because, of course, Londongrad is one of the big enabling forces, actually, of Putin's regime, and may even have given him the signal that the West would not resist. But I find it fascinating, this idea of normalization. And even now, you still hear this from some military guys. You still hear this from diplomats. I've been to a lot of events over the last couple of months, and there'll always be some ex-diplomat who pops up and suggests some kind of rational response. Why don't we do this for Putin? Why don't we just give him Crimea and we can sign a treaty and it'll all be lovely? And there still seems to be this process of trying to normalize and look at Russia as a state which by and large functions the way the Western state does. And it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, there's almost no comparison between the structure and function of the Russian state and a Western state.
Yeah, what it goes to is just a total misunderstanding of how Vladimir Putin acts, which is that he doesn't care about his country. I mean, the basic model here that people need to understand how Putin is he went into public service, not public service because he's not interested in serving the public, to steal money. And it's not unusual. It's not like he's like some particularly evil Russian who went into public service to steal money. Everybody who goes to work in the government in Russia, from the lowest traffic cop up to the president, goes to steal money. It's just what everybody does. That's people would snicker at you if you were a government servant and you weren't stealing money. That's why they did do it. And he was particularly good at stealing money. He stole unbelievable amounts of money, hundreds of billions of dollars of money. And after a while, he stole so much money that he put himself in just the most impossible position, because he can never step down. Unlike Saakashvili, who could lose in a democratic election and go and do something else, Putin can never step down. If he steps down, he's killed so many people, he's arrested so many people, taken hostage so many people, stolen so much money, done so many crimes that he would immediately be arrested if he was no longer president. He'd lose all his money and he'd probably die. And so for Putin, there is only one way forward, which is to stay in power until the end of his natural life.
I mean, that also explains his strategy as well, which is right at the start of the war, listening to people who actually have studied Putin, and they said, well, watch out for this, because he will never de-escalate. He will always, if he feels he has a chance of victory, he will escalate to the point where his strategy fails, and then he'll do something different. But at this point, he seems to still be on that escalation curve. And is it because for him this is life or death? This is all or nothing?
Well, I would argue just starting the war was life or death for him. He didn't know at what point the Russians would come for him, but he knew that sooner or later, if he's been around for 22 years and he's stolen all their money, sooner or later something's going to happen. Like that fruit seller in Tunisia who sets himself on fire and starts the Arab Spring. He knew that something would happen sooner or later, and he didn't want to wait to find out. And by the way, it happened in a bunch of neighboring countries. In Belarus, they had a fake election, and Lukashenko won, or actually lost by a landslide, and the Belarusian people rose up, and Lukashenko probably would have been toppled if Putin hadn't sent his own people in to save him. And then it actually succeeded in Kazakhstan, where one weekend they raised the price of liquefied petroleum gas for cars, which is what they used to fuel their cars. And all of a sudden, everything was on fire in all the government buildings and presidential palace. And the dictator had been around for even longer than Putin, gets deposed. And so Putin understands that he needed to avoid that fate. And how do you avoid that fate? At some indeterminate time in the future, people are going to come for you. Well, you just pick up Machiavelli, the prince. You create an enemy that's not you. So redirect people's anger away from you towards some foreigners and start a war. That's what the war is all about. And so he started this war thinking it would be a quick war. He'd win, and then he'd have elevated, an enemy there and elevated approval ratings. But it turns out that we're 1 year into this, and it hasn't worked out so well for him. And he has no choice. If he shows any sign of weakness at any point in this conflict, then the Russian people will come for him again. they can't stand a weak leader. They have no tolerance for that whatsoever. In a dictatorship, strongman country like Russia, you've got to be the strongest, most vicious person out there. And so there's only one way that this thing can go. Well, two ways. Either he continues to escalate and defeats the Ukrainians, or the Ukrainians fight him back and destroy him. There's not a situation where he turns around and says, okay, I've had enough, let's negotiate. I mean, this is a huge misconception on the part of pretty much all Western governments, that there's going to be some moment when he's going to say, okay, this is not working out for me, I'm ready to negotiate. That's just not going to happen. He doesn't do that. He's never done that. And he doesn't have to do that. He a person who is interested in the national interests of their country would do that, but he doesn't care about Russia. He'll throw 5 million, able-bodied men into the meat grinder if that's what it takes to stay in power. He'll burn through every last dollar of savings that they have to stay in power. He'll do anything to stay in power. And so it's just a complete naivete to think that there's going to be, we don't want to give Ukraine enough weapons to defeat Putin because he's unpredictable. We just want to get to a point of a negotiation. Well, that's just not going to happen.
And he's counting on that, isn't he? He's counting on Western hesitancy. He's counting on disunity emerging, and he's counting on the fact that as democracies, when the economic pain reaches a certain pitch, the people in various countries in the West are going to demand, peace. And they're not going to fight at any price. I mean, at the moment, I don't think we have this mindset that we're in the Second World War, that we're in a fight for our own survival. We don't have that mindset at the moment, whereas he clearly does. So this is a very difficult year, isn't it? This is the year where he probably still believes that through attrition, he can outlast the West and reach his goals. And I think he, through a very, very boring State of the Union speech today, which I didn't watch in full because it was far too boring, he more or less said the same thing. He's going to stick to his guns.
Yep. Well, he will stick to his guns. And his big bet is that in 2024, there'll be a change of U.S. government. And the new president of the United States will be maybe Donald Trump. And the U.S. will stop supporting Ukraine. And if that were to happen, Ukraine would fail because they're succeeding almost exclusively because of the U.S. support. I mean, of course, British support is helpful, and so is German and Polish support. But if you look at the numbers, the U.S. is vastly more important than anybody. And that's what he's banking on. And so we kind of have to get this war. The Ukrainians have to defeat Russia before the 2024 U.S. presidential elections, because we don't know that's the biggest uncertainty. And you can kind of see it. You can kind of see that's what Biden is doing. I mean, I think Biden is hoping to be reelected and so on, but he's all the restrictions and red lines we made for ourselves about what we wouldn't do for Ukraine are all kind of going out the window. I mean, the last thing remaining are jets for the Ukrainians, and Rishi Sunak said that jets are on the table. We're training the pilots. I think that's the first sign that everyone is going to sort of move their nose up to the bar, and that's going to be the next thing that we all agree on. And then that's it. We've given the Ukrainians, at least in category terms, what they've asked for, not necessarily in absolute numbers of tanks and missiles, but they've asked for artillery, they've asked for long range artillery, they've asked for tanks, asked for jets. They're going to get all that stuff in the end, and hopefully they can get them in enough quantity so they can actually defeat the Russians before the U.S. presidential election in 2024.
But there is a challenge, isn't there? I think, we're neither of us are military people, but I have heard quite a bit of discussion around the fact that a lot of this conflict has been fought, very much like not even World War II, but World War I, vast amounts of artillery shells, huge numbers of munitions. And my understanding is that in any given month, Ukraine is firing off more shells than the US produces in a year. So we're not running out yet, but at some point, if we don't tool up our economy into a kind of war economy to match the stockpiles that Russia has, there is the threat that Russia might physically outlast our supply systems.
That's true. That's true. And although Russia is also running out, because I mean, whatever Ukraine is doing, Russia is doing 3 times as much, and they were running out. But the problem is that a couple of days ago, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken announced that U.S. has intelligence that the Chinese are about to start resupplying Russia. And if that were to be the case, that would be a potential game changer in how the war ends up being, resolving itself, very much to the negative of Ukraine.
That obviously has huge geopolitical implications as well. China is not a massively sanctioned society, despite vast human rights abuses, etc. But we don't apply the same sanctions to China at this point, and I assume we have some back channels to try and dissuade them from openly engaging in the war. But that would be a very worrying trend. The other question I wanted to ask here is about Russia itself. And Putin hasn't just dominated this country for 20 years. Over the period when you were working there, and I've been observing it, he's been on a process of degrading and destroying every institution in that country. And it is unprecedented, isn't it, for nuclear power, a complex post-industrial society, which basically has the political sophistication of a sort of Viking warlord kingdom.
Yeah. Well, it's both terrible for Russia. So there's no more press. All free press has been destroyed. There's no courts. All courts report to the Kremlin. There's no independent political. There's no political parties. Just the ruling party and fake opposition parties. There's no more electorate because there's no. They stuff the ballot boxes. And so you end up having this situation, and there's nobody who can challenge or succeed Putin as a sort of natural successor because Putin is so worried about being overthrown. So that's really terrible for Russia. But in a certain way, it's a double-edged sword for Putin and for Putinism, because it's not like if Putin were to die or to be overthrown, that there's sort of a natural evolution of the system. By having just one guy, having it be so key man dependent, the whole system sort of falls apart. And so it's entirely possible and plausible that if Putin were to be, if there was a public popular uprising because of, the Russians wake up one day and realize how crazy and self-destructive this war was, you could end up with a situation where a real sort of black swan event emerges. And that could be Alexei Navalny or Ilya Yashin or Vladimir Kara-Murza leading the Russian people out of this catastrophic mess that Putin put them into. I don't give a high probability to that, but I remember when Egypt finally cracked, Mubarak, who was their dictator for like 3 or 4 decades, when he finally disappeared, and it was the same type of thing where there was just a vertical of power. He was the only guy. And the only thing that they could revert to at that time was the Muslim Brotherhood, because that was the only sort of organized political force. Well, Russia doesn't have that, but they have these opposition people who are all sitting in jail, kind of more like Mandela and the ANC, who are all sitting in jail waiting for their moment. And so, everybody poo-poos me when I say that this is a plausible, sort of political alternative, but this is the main political alternative other than Putinism. And Putin could die in his sleep, and then some other terrible Siloviki, warmongering person could take his place, or the system could crack and crater, and all those guys run for the hills and get on their private jets and leave Russia because they're also scared of the Russian people. And then the Russian people are going to say, well, who's been challenging this awfulness? And then they say, well, this guy Alexei Navalny, who's been sitting in jail for the last X number of years, break down the prison gates and, put him on their shoulders, and he becomes, escort him to the Kremlin. I mean, it's kind of a fantasy, but it's not necessarily an unrealistic one.
Ukrainians have issues with many Russian opposition, and we can understand, in the depths of their struggle with Russia at the moment, I think they tend to have a more jaded view even of Russian opposition. But there's another monster that Putin has created, isn't there, during this war? All through his tenure, he has fostered and counted on the support of extreme nationalists, certainly many that are, religiously driven as well, so extreme right religious nationalists. There is a certain, dare I say it, similarity with some elements, let's say, in the US, albeit they perhaps don't have quite as much political clout there. But Putin has created this sort of monster. And during the war, he's become ever more dependent on military bloggers and so on. And they seem to be the only section of society where a level of criticism of the regime, not of him directly, but of our apparatchiks and the army, he's kind of tolerated or maybe even fostered this extreme right mill blogger type opposition. I think opposition is probably a loose term because much of it is probably orchestrated or semi approved by the state. But that's maybe a worrying trend as well, that if you have 10, 15% of the country could be classed as sort of liberal, as some of the key figures you've just mentioned, there is an equal shadow portion of the population who are also politically active, but in a completely scary way. So Russia's fate could equally be some form of nationalistic, fascistic takeover.
Well, but I think this is a bit of a Kremlin Putin planted myth. He is a nationalistic, fascist, son of a bitch, who has started multiple wars against his neighbor, killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of innocent people, who threatened the West with nuclear war, who gets involved in interfering in elections all over the world, who's bribing, blackmailing politicians in Africa and Asia and so on and so forth. I mean, and he puts some guy like Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, out there and lets him sort of thump his chest and make all sorts of public statements. And I think it's all by design to say, look, here's the alternative. You should be happy with me. But I mean, it might be a different style, but it's all the same thing. I mean, Putin is, he's killed 140,000 of his own young men in a war that never had any purpose. Not to mention all the Ukrainians he's killed and all the damage he's done to Ukraine. I don't think that there's any worse than you can get than that. And it just doesn't ring true to me anyways. I think it's sort of this is just his way of trying to convince the Macrons and Scholzes of the world that they somehow need to negotiate with him and appease him even now, because they don't want to get deal with whoever is going to come worse than him.
Mm. I think that makes a lot of sense there, especially as we know that if any political voice is tolerated in Russia, it's not an independent voice, is it? And you would have observed the takeover of the parliament, the gradual squeezing out of any opposition voices. You mentioned a few there with Ilya Yashin and others. Obviously, the biggest challenger was Boris Nemtsov, the perhaps most statesmanlike and morally unambiguous character with a big personality on the Russian scene, also massively intelligent. What does this also tell us about Putin? He doesn't tolerate any rivals, does he? As soon as he sees somebody popping their head up, potentially challenging him or looking like a future leader, he seeks to destroy them.
Yes, he completely destroys anybody who has any ability to challenge him. It's interesting because he had a kind of threshold before. He back in the day when it wasn't when the stakes weren't so high for him, he'd allow Alexei Navalny to make his movies and Boris Nemtsov to write his reports and give speeches, and it was all kind of, and Boris Nemtsov would organize a demonstration, and 500 people would show up, and it was kind of he tolerated it. It was annoyance, but he tolerated it. But as he became more and more scared, and as the crowds became more responsive, and Boris Nemtsov, for example, was going to organize a demonstration where perhaps 100,000 people were going to show up back in 2015. Then he felt like the threat was too great, and then he killed him. And that's the same thing he tried to do with Navalny with the Novichok. And so, there's only three types of opposition leaders: those who are dead, those who are in prison, and those who are in exile. There's not a single one that's actually in place in Russia. And of course, Putin then, if there's an election, they put up few fake people who are like, the Communist Party of Russia, which are, sort of captive fake opposition. And, he got Prokhorov, who is a Russian oligarch, Mikhail Prokhorov, who is a multi-billionaire, to run a campaign, fully understanding that he wasn't really running for anything. And I think Xenia Sobchak, the socialite, so he gets a bunch of people, and then he goes to the West and says, look, we have a very dynamic and fractious political process, and by the way, if any of these people were ever to get any kind of popularity, they would be destroyed and the ballot boxes would be stuffed anyways. It's all just a sort of pantomime of an election. But there is no opposition. There can't be any opposition, and Putin is extremely threatened, vulnerable. He can't even sit at a table with his own people now because he's so scared of everything. And so it's a terrible, terrible time for Russians, and it's a terrible time for the Russian opposition because all these people, they're Russian citizens, and so a lot of people sort of, it's very black and white. They hate Russians and love Ukrainians, but there are a lot of Russians standing up to Putin, and they're sort of being lumped in with Russians generally. And I was on a stage with Alexei Navalny's daughter, Dasha, giving a speech, and we were all criticizing Putin and so on. And someone came up and was attacking her for being Russian in the audience, and it was like really unfair. I mean, her father is in jail, dying for standing up to Putin, and it's pretty black and white. But there are a subset of Russians who are really trying to unseat Putin, and we should be, as much as we're supplying weapons to Ukrainians, we should be supporting the Russians who are trying to overthrow Putin.
That's a really interesting point, and that may well be the sort of point we end on there. And it's really about whether the West responds. I was going to ask, whether our response has consistently been too little, too late, and is the West response really lacking a strategic purpose? Do we have any idea of the kind of Russia we want to emerge from this? I know some people say, well, Russia's affairs are Russia's affairs. Let Russia sort it out. It's patently clear, I think, that Russians have not been able to sort out their own affairs, not deal with their own political system, and they need help. They need help to define how to make that transition into a democratic society. So I'm going to broaden that question out. I know we're doing too little, too late sometimes on the military front, but are we also not doing enough to support those in Russia who are seeking to change the system?
I completely am appalled at how we let all these guys, like my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, who's facing 24 years in Russian jail for standing up to Putin. He's both a Russian citizen and a dual citizen of the UK. I have been advocating for Magnitsky sanctions against people who have persecuted him. Canada was the first country to do that, and Britain still hasn't. He's a British citizen, and Britain still hasn't sanctioned the people. I mean, if Britain is, putting their money where their mouth is, they should at least support one of their own citizens who's going to pay the ultimate price of 24 years in prison for treason. They should be all over this case. That this should be the British equivalent of the way that America advocated for the release of Brittany Griner. This guy should be getting every bit of political diplomatic pressure from the British government, but there's been pretty much just blah blah blah. We're giving consular support, blah blah blah, and so yeah, there's a lot more that we can do, a lot more we should do. It's not to say that the Western response is bad. I mean, everything we've done on the military side has been good, and as you say, too little, too late. But it's kept Ukraine from being defeated. I think we need to give Ukraine more so that they triumph. But on the same side, we should be supporting the Russians who could be leading Russia out of this complete mess, who are opposed to Putin, because there's not that many of them, and they create a very strong incentive not to oppose Putin. We should at least give those people a little bit of a lifeline.
And I think, one of the reasons this channel was created was because clearly Ukrainians, from their various revolutions, the Revolution of Dignity, and the huge force that they met, their would-be dictator with, Ukraine provides an example of where that works. But as I speak to more and more Ukrainians, I realize that there is a huge investment in education and civil society. There are massive programs of work, both funded by the West, but also, generated within Ukraine itself. Shouldn't we be doing more of that as well? Helping to train Russians up with, liberal legal degrees, education, trying to help them build an infrastructure of civil society in absentia, so that when Putin does fall, it can be transplanted into Russia.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. And I know that Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is the very first major political prisoner, has been working on that on a steady basis since he got out of jail with his public works and others as well. And it's it's kind of, I mean, it's a bit like changing the deck chairs on the Titanic right now. I mean, there's so many issues, including the boat, sinking, that it's sort of almost hard to focus on anything else. But yeah, absolutely.
Well, Bill, I think that's a great place to end on. It's been I look forward to speak to you for a very long time now and get your insights into the current situation. I think it's incredibly important that people understand that Putin is still on that escalatory curve and shouldn't be appeased at any cost. And of course, I wish you many more lucky days, to put it in your words earlier, or an infinite number of lucky days.
Thank you very much. Great conversation. Have a good day.